Somehow, the biggest beat 'em up ever made for the Sega Mega Drive has been out for nearly half a decade now, yet I've still never actually talked about it. That's right, despite all of the headlines, the chaos, and the sheer audacity of the thing, Paprium has quietly sat there on the shelf of gaming history, glaring at me like a neon-soaked reminder of unfinished business. Because for all of its technical brilliance, Paprium remains one of the most divisive releases the retro scene has ever witnessed. A game that dazzled with its scale and spectacle, yet became infamous for the bedlam surrounding it. Even now, years after its so-called launch, fresh twists keep surfacing, legal battles rumble on, furious backers continue to chase refunds that may never come, and every few months some new fragment of drama reignites the argument over whether Paprium was a misunderstood masterpiece or one of gaming's most audacious cons. Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. This is why the infamous Paprium caused so much outrage, and of course continues to do so. Let's be honest, you probably won't be getting your hands on Paprium anytime soon. Unless of course you fancy handing over $400 or more to some grinning scalper on eBay. Thankfully though, we're living through a full-blown beat-em-up renaissance, and unlike Paprium, to own them, these ones won't require you to remortgage the house. Right now you can grab Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge for 53% off, Streets of Rage 4 for 66% off, Double Dragon Gaiden for 83% off, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Cowabunga Collection for 78% off, and the Capcom Beat-em-up Bundle for over 85% off. Plus massive savings on thousands of other games while you're at it. There are thousands of deals to be had, so go on, indulge in your brawler addiction, support this channel at the same time, and enjoy the rest of the video.
And now for something completely different.
The YouTube algorithm has been utterly ridiculous lately, therefore it's more important than ever that each of you like this video, make sure you're subscribed and leave me a spicy comment down below. And I would also like to give all of you a massive thank you who hit the hype button last week. Yes, that's not satire, YouTube have literally added a hype button, and that last video did very well, so maybe it actually works. So huge thank you to everybody who hit that, and I would love it if you hit it again. Yeah! Paprium, it was billed as nothing less than the triumphant resurrection of the Sega Mega Drive, a bold, audacious promise that the legendary ancient 16-bit warhorse could still deliver something new, something dazzling, and something that would make the entire retro scene sit up and take notice. Just a quick glance at Paprium was enough to make any fan of beat-em-ups who grew up in the early 90s console wars salivate at the mouth. Yet what unfolded instead was a slow-motion catastrophe that has now dragged on for over a decade, leaving behind a trail of missed deadlines, vanished pre-orders, furious backers, whispered accusations of fraud, and even an infamous launch party so farcical it has since become legendary for all the wrong reasons. What began as a dream of uniting nostalgic fans around a cutting-edge new cartridge ultimately descended into one of the most chaotic sagas in modern gaming history, leaving a community that had once been enthralled now embittered, divided, and demanding answers. So, holding these thoughts, how did Paprium go from being hailed as the Mega Drive's great second coming to being remembered as one of the most high-profile controversies the retro gaming world has ever seen? Back in 2012, the Paprium project would first emerge under the codename Project Y. It was framed not just as another homebrew experiment, but as a bold declaration that the Sega Mega Drive still had untapped potential locked away somewhere within its aging but yet beautiful silicon, and that Watermelon Games had found the key to be the ones to unleash it. Promoting the game, they painted a vision of a sprawling cyberpunk beat-em-up that would stretch the old console to its absolute breaking point. Powered by a custom-built Dayton Meister chip, said to grant the game a colossal 80 megabits of storage, it would have 14 extra channels of crisp digital audio layered atop the Mega Drive's native sound, and a staggering 446 layers of parallax to give its ruined neon cityscapes impossible depth. What wasn't to be excited about? To those who adored the machine, this wasn't just marketing fluff, it was the kind of breathless promise that suggested we might have been about to witness history. A moment in which someone finally showed the world what a 16-bit console could do when stripped of every restraint. And for a time, it felt like something extraordinary really was taking shape. Sadly though, just not in the way retro gamers would have preferred. Paprium was the brainchild of two men who, despite living on opposite sides of the world, were bound together by an almost evangelical belief that the Mega Drive still had glory left to give. On one side was Tullio Adriano Cardasso Goncalves, a level-headed organiser who handled the business and logistics. On the other side was a fiercely ambitious programmer and designer who goes by the nickname of Fonzie, who saw himself less as a developer and more of a revolutionary, but more in his antics soon. As for this dynamic duo, their paths first crossed through the old Eidolons in forums, a tight-knit Sega fan community where in 2004 a scrappy homebrew RPG project known as Tavern RPG slowly evolved into Pier Solar. Against all expectations, that game eventually launched in 2010 and became a cult hit, proving that even decades after Sega had left the console business, a dedicated team could still produce and sell brand new Mega Drive cartridges. Pier Solar and the Great Architects was beyond impressive, a project so grand that most people assumed it would never actually happen. It began as a light-hearted homebrew joke, a simple 16-bit role-playing game starring the forum's regulars. Yet over the course of 6 years, that joke hardened into something more serious. A full-length, lavishly produced JRPG developed from scratch for real Sega Mega Drive cartridges, complete with bespoke artwork, a sweeping soundtrack, and physical packaging as lavish as games of the console's original era. When Pier Solar finally launched in 2010, it didn't just defy expectations, it shattered them. Thousands of copies were snapped up almost immediately, making it the best-selling post-mortem Mega Drive game in history, and proving once and for all that there was a paying audience for brand new software on supposedly dead hardware. For the retro community, it felt like a miracle, not a quick ROM hack or a novelty demo, but a genuine full-scale release on a then 30-year-old system, crafted with enough polish and ambition to stand proudly alongside the classics it was emulating. That success made Pier Solar more than just a curiosity, and became a proof of concept, a rallying point for the idea that passion projects could punch through the grave soil of long-abandoned consoles and give them new life. It showed that if you were talented enough, determined enough, and just a little bit reckless, you could still make history on the Mega Drive. That unlikely triumph emboldened the two gentlemen to form Watermelon Games formally, as a proper company. No longer just hobbyists tinkering in their spare time, but entrepreneurs convinced they could turn nostalgia itself into a viable business model. To fund their next grand vision, known then as Project Y, Watermelon didn't simply open pre-orders, they built an entire micro-economy around it. Through what they called their bespoke magical game factory platform, fans could buy digital currency called gems, which they then used to vote on the game's design, the system it would run on, the genre it would adopt, even the tone of its setting. The community overwhelmingly chose the Mega Drive, a side-scrolling brawler framework, and a lurid cyberpunk aesthetic, effectively giving birth to Project Y in real time, a rare early example of fully participatory development years before Kickstarter would make the concept more fashionable. The model generated a frenzy of enthusiasm and cash, with Watermelon promising a 2013 release while steadily rolling out more pre-order tiers and collector editions as the years drafted by. Still, not all was rosy behind the Paprium scenes. An imbalance of power had been simmering ever since the days of Pier Solar, and it was one of the first cracks that ultimately tore Watermelon apart. Back then, as mentioned, that game had grown out of the old Eidolons in forums, and much of its art, writing and music had been contributed by passionate volunteers from the community. They weren't paid, they were promised credits, copies of the game, and the satisfaction of helping resurrect the Mega Drive. At first, that seemed enough. Pier Solar was a genuine passion project, and everyone involved believed they were part of something historic. But as it neared completion, Watermelon formalised itself as a company, boxed and sold the game for real money, and many of those unpaid contributors watched their work being commercially exploited without ever seeing a cut of the profits. Tullio had been the one trying to juggle all of that, and when it came to both Pier Solar and Paprium, he would be the one intended to handle shipping, logistics and finances, while Fonzie increasingly withdrew into secrecy. What had once been a collaborative, community-driven effort was mutating into a one-man empire, where information was jealously guarded and outside input was treated as interference. Soon, every aspect of development was locked behind his closed doors, while Tullio found himself stuck on the front line fielding complaints from unpaid former contributors, angry customers and confused partners who couldn't get straight answers about where their money was going. By 2015, the strain became untenable. Tullio quietly left the company, disillusioned by what Watermelon had become, and unwilling to take the blame for a project he no longer had any real control over. With his departure, whatever balance had once existed in Cyber Studio vanished completely. The company that had started as a community passion project had now become the personal fiefdom of a single man, and the fate of Project Y rested entirely in Fonzie's hands. This, in effect, created the perfect conditions for catastrophe, granting a single developer near total control over a vast pool of money with virtually no oversight, and no clear way for backers to hold him accountable when things began to go wrong. As the months bled into years, the grand promises of Project Y quietly began to dissolve into a fog of silence. Updates, once full of swagger and ambition, slowed to a pitiful trickle, barely 1.4 posts a month across Watermelon's official channels, and even those offered little more than cryptic half-statements or defensive ramblings. The situation became so opaque that Lewis Martins, the game's own lead artist, publicly admitted he had been completely cut off from the project, left pleading for basic information while the supposed launch window came and went. Fonzie meanwhile seemed to grow more elusive and more erratic with each passing year. On Facebook, he resurfaced after long disappearances, with bizarre posts about being at the factories for many weeks and having parts in storage since 2016, assuring anyone still listening that people who know knows, a phrase that read less like reassurance and more like the manifesto of someone slipping into siege mentality. In podcast interviews, his tone turned openly paranoid. He ranted about unnamed saboteurs flooding the site with fake orders, bots and political correctness conspiring to bring Watermelon down. By then, trust had withered to almost nothing. What had once been a rallying point for retro enthusiasts now looked like the private obsession of a man barricaded against the world, and for the thousands who had sunk their money and faith into Paprium, the growing silence felt less like caution and more like abandonment. But of course, there was plenty more nonsense to come. By 2018, with years of silence behind him and backer frustration reaching a boiling point, Fonzie decided to stage what he framed as Paprium's grand coming out party. A lavish launch event in Paris to coincide with the Mega Drive's 30th anniversary, complete with DJs, arcade machines, branded decor, and the promise that attendees would finally see this mythical game in action. It was meant to be the triumphant moment when all the doubts were swept aside, a spectacle to prove that the long wait had been worth it. Instead, it became the moment everything collapsed further. On the night, what appeared on screen wasn't a finished game at all, but a fragile alpha build that could barely function. The levels were devoid of enemies, the sound was completely missing, and the game crashed so frequently that Fonzie was caught on camera desperately covering glitches with his hands or slamming reset before the system locked up entirely. Even sympathetic attendees admitted the backgrounds and character art looked impressive for Mega Drive hardware, but there was no escaping the fact that this was nowhere near complete, let alone ready to ship. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Any remaining faith the community had clung to evaporated overnight, as forums lit up with outrage, social media filled with derision, and disillusioned staff quietly walked away from the project altogether. Within weeks, Watermelon had deactivated its refund system and shut down its support email, leaving angry customers shouting into a void. What was supposed to be Paprium's victory lap instead marked the moment its credibility disintegrated in front of a live audience, and the damage to Watermelon's reputation would never be undone. As outrage mounted, Fonzie settled on a single explanation to justify the endless delays. He insisted year after year that PayPal had seized Watermelon's funds without warning, supposedly locking away the money from pre-orders and leaving him unable to manufacture or ship Paprium at all. It became his go-to defense, repeated in interviews, Facebook posts, and Kickstarter updates, a neat ready-made villain to blame whenever backers demanded to know where their games or their refunds had gone. But the more he leaned on this story, the less it held up. No documentation was ever produced to prove any account freeze had actually happened, and even if it had, industry observers noted that legitimate businesses facing such issues can usually provide statements, appeal decisions, or simply change payment processes, something Fonzie claimed he would do, yet never did. In fact, despite alleging that PayPal had crippled the company, he repeatedly returned to using it for new orders, a contradiction that only deepened suspicions. The timing of his claims made people even warier. Every time a wave of customers began asking for refunds, talk of frozen accounts would suddenly flare up again, stalling payouts without ever resolving them. At one point, Watermelon even rallied its remaining supporters behind a Change.org petition, insisting the company had fulfilled all its obligations and that PayPal was wrongfully withholding their earnings, a statement that critics tore apart as a calculated attempt to rewrite the narrative and manipulate public sympathy. For many backers, that was the final straw. What had once sounded like bad luck increasingly looked like a deliberate smokescreen, a convenient fiction that allowed Fonzie to deflect accountability while the money and the years continued to slip away. Despite more red flags than a parade in communist China, the once thought to be impossible happened. Paprium was shipped. That's right, in December 2020, after nearly a decade of silence, excuses and scattered drama, physical copies began arriving on the doorsteps of bewildered backers. For some it felt like vindication, proof that Fonzie hadn't simply vanished with their money after all, but for many others the reality of the cartridge in their hands didn't erase the sour taste left by years of misleading updates, broken promises and missed deadlines. No press copies were distributed, no review embargoes existed and no proper PR campaign accompanied the release. Such a long-hyped project, it slipped almost silently past the mainstream gaming press, not because the game itself was terrible, but because nobody trusted Watermelon enough to engage with it. Years of burnt bridges had finally caught up to them, and the Mega Drive release landed with a thud instead of a roar. What made the whole debacle even stranger was that once people actually played Paprium, many were stunned to discover that it was good. Not just decent for a homebrew good, but genuinely impressive by any 16-bit standard. Underneath all the drama, Fonzie had quietly produced one of the most technically ambitious Mega Drive games ever made, a sprawling cyberpunk brawler with gigantic sprites, a thumping FM soundtrack, and visuals that pushed the console so far past its usual limits that it seemed almost impossible it was running on original hardware. After years of memes about vaporware and scams, the game's sheer quality blindsided everyone. Mechanically, it played like a classic belt-scrolling beat-em-up, but with a surprising amount of depth. Players could choose from multiple characters with distinct fighting styles, chain together combo attacks, throw enemies into environmental hazards, and smash through destructible scenery as they carved a path through the grimy neon-soaked streets. It felt like the kind of lavish arcade experience Sega themselves might have built if they'd given the Mega Drive one last blockbuster before retiring it. With the use of its custom expansion chip dubbed the Datameister, the cartridge can pull off tricks the stock console simply wasn't designed for, like pumping out hundreds of colours on screen, dynamically streaming audio, and animating colossal sprites without the usual slowdown or flicker. Combined with its pulsing synth soundtrack and slick pixel art, it looked and sounded more like a mid-90s Neo Geo title than something on a humble 1988 machine. Reviews from the period who finally received their copies were often laced with disbelief. After so many years of broken promises, few had expected the end product to be anything more than a curiosity. Gidget ended up earning genuine praise as one of the best post-mortem releases ever produced for the system. In an alternate timeline, one where Watermelon had simply delivered it on schedule without the circus of excuses and feuds, Paprium could have been remembered as a triumphant indie classic. Instead, it became a paradox, an undeniably brilliant game whose own creator had sabotaged its legacy long before it even left the warehouse. But we are not even close to being finished with this video yet, as unfortunately, the Paprium story doesn't end here. When the December 2020 launch happened, and Paprium finally did begin trickling out to customers, the result only deepened the chaos. Only a tiny fraction of backers received copies, yet even these were plagued by problems. Many wouldn't run on certain Mega Drive models, others arrived with loose components rattling inside the cartridge shell, and support from Watermelon was practically non-existent. The game's bespoke Datameister chip, once trumpeted as the secret to its technical wizardry, became a liability. Its unconventional design created compatibility nightmares, and its innards were sealed so tightly that even seasoned modders struggled to diagnose the faults. For most backers though, there was simply nothing to test at all. Orders dating back as far as 2017 still hadn't materialised, and forums are littered with comments from people who have long since written off their money as gone. Still, with all of this going on, rather than winding the saga down, Fonzie attempted to reignite it in 2021 with a bold new Kickstarter campaign promising not only to deliver the long overdue Mega Drive copies, but to bring Paprium to modern platforms like the PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5, Nintendo Switch and Steam. The campaign roared to life almost instantly, raking in an extraordinary €895,569, from 3,271 backers who hoped this would finally be the turning point, the moment the years of excuses gave way to actual games arriving on their doorsteps. But for all those who put that money forward, they have clearly never listened to the sage advice of George W. Bush.
Fool me once, shame on you. If fool me, we can't get fooled again.
True to form, the project was swaddled in theatrical excess, with reward tiers that bordered on absurd. At the very top sat a $10,000 arcade cabinet pledge, offering one of 3 bespoke Paprium arcade machines and a personal appearance within the game itself, while more modest tiers promised boxed copies, soundtracks and lavish collector trinkets. Yet once the campaign ended, the familiar silence crept back in. Deadlines passed, communication dried up, and by 2024 the promised ports were nowhere to be seen, and the physical copies still undelivered and the trust stretched to breaking point. That year, a bizarre hoax also briefly jolted the community back to life when a YouTuber by the username of Paravex staged a video showing crates of Paprium cartridges supposedly discovered in a French warehouse, sparking a frenzy of speculation that the long missing stock had finally been found. When the video was exposed as fake, outrage exploded all over again, and this time it didn't just dissipate. A group of furious backers launched a coordinated class action campaign, gathering testimonies under the guidance of French lawyer John Bastardi Dumont in a bid to drag Watermelon into court and force a reckoning. What was once a niche passion project had by now spiraled into full-blown legal warfare, and the tone of the conversation around Paprium had shifted completely, from curiosity tinged with frustration to open talk of fraud, lawsuits and prison sentences. As the case gathered momentum, dozens of disillusioned backers came forward to submit sworn statements, bank records and email chains documenting their experiences with Watermelon. Many alleged that they had paid in full for their copies of Paprium years prior, only to be stonewalled when asked for updates or refunds. Bastardi, which is the best name for a lawyer ever by the way, legal strategy centered on claims of abus de confiance, abuse of trust, a French civil offence that treats failure to deliver paid goods as potential fraud when coupled with prolonged deception. The sheer volume of testimonies painted a picture of systematic malpractice rather than isolated mistakes, transforming what had once been seen as a messy indie delay into something resembling a consumer rights scandal. The legal team also unearthed some troubling financial details. Several backers alleged that Watermelon had continued to accept fresh orders long after it became clear they could not fulfill their original obligations, effectively using new revenue to plug old debt. Behaviour Bastardi described as Ponzi-like in tone, if not in structure. There was also questions raised about the handling of the Kickstarter funds, as no transparent accounting had ever been provided. Even though crowdfunding campaigns operate in a legal grey area, French consumer law still obliges companies to either deliver products or issue refunds within a reasonable timeframe, a line Watermelon was widely accused of crossing years ago. By mid-2024, the class action has coalesced into a formal complaint submitted to the Tribunal Judiciaire in Paris, backed by a coalition of French and international claimants. While the court initially took time to assess whether the case met the threshold for group litigation, its very existence rattled what little remained of Watermelon's reputation. Retro gaming forums, once filled with speculation about Paprium's technology and art style, are now clogged with people sharing legal resources, drafting complaint letters, and discussing how to join the suit. The narrative had shifted entirely. Watermelon are no longer seen as an eccentric indie studio, but as a rogue operator facing the full weight of the law. Fonzie has predictably responded to the lawsuit in the same way he had to most criticism, by going silent. No public statements were issued, no legal rebuttals posted, and no evidence provided to refute the accusations. This vacuum only deepened the perception that the company had collapsed inward, with even some of its most ardent defenders on social media beginning to quietly delete their old posts. In a way, the silence said more than any rebuttal could. After years of bluster and theatrics, Watermelon had nothing left to say. What began as a starry-eyed dream to revive the glory days of 16-bit gaming has curdled into a cautionary tale, and now the courts are being asked to deliver the ending that Watermelon never would. As of mid-2025, no definitive outcome from the lawsuit or class action efforts over Paprium have been published. The situation still seems to be ongoing, with backers and consumer advocacy groups pushing for legal redress, but no court has ruled yet. With many reportedly left out of pocket and with no game to play, many gamers have now turned to emulation. When it comes to 16-bit Mega Drive games, this is usually a straightforward preservation effort, but when it comes to emulating Paprium, for many it's turned into something resembling a moral crusade. From the start, Paprium seemed deliberately engineered to resist emulation. After all, its cartridge wasn't just a plastic shell with ROM chips inside. It carried a custom coprocessor, which handled data streaming, enhanced audio, and sprite manipulation in ways that standard Mega Drive hardware, let alone emulators, had never encountered. For years, even the most advanced Mega Drive emulators couldn't run it at all, producing only black screens or bizarre graphical glitches. This meant that unlike almost every other retro game, there was no legal or illicit way to archive Paprium digitally. The only way to play it was to buy one of the elusive physical cartridges, and given how many backers never received theirs, that effectively locked much of the community out. As frustration grew, the game became less a collector's item and more of a symbol of lost trust, and some preservationists began to argue that cracking it was no longer just about convenience, but about principle. For them, Watermelon's refusal to provide digital builds or functional ROMs wasn't protecting their intellectual property, it was holding a finished work of art hostage. Over time, small groups of hobbyists began poking at the code, reverse engineering the cartridge's unique data flow, and experimenting with FPGA implementations and modified emulators. Each minor breakthrough sparked jubilation across forums, as if they were breaching the walls of a fortress rather than debugging a 16-bit brawler. It wasn't just technical tinkering anymore, it carried a whiff of rebellion. People who had once simply wanted to play Paprium were now framing their efforts as a moral stand. Essentially, if Watermelon wouldn't preserve its own game, the community would do it for them. In the eyes of many, Paprium had ceased to be Fonzie's personal property the moment he failed to deliver it to his paying customers, and the act of cracking it became less about theft than about liberation. Looking back, Paprium's collapse wasn't just a story of one disastrous game. It exposed how fragile the entire crowdfunding model can become when it's built on nothing more than trust and spectacle. There was no investors scrutinising budgets, no publishers demanding milestones, no external oversight at all. Just one man holding the purse strings while thousands of hopeful backers convinced themselves that passion alone would be enough to carry the project to the finish line. That absence of accountability allowed Fonzie to operate with near total impunity, funneling wave after wave of community money into a black box of secretive development while offering little more than vague reassurances in return. He understood that many fans desperately wanted to believe they were witnessing a once-in-a-lifetime resurrection of their beloved Mega Drive, and he weaponized that belief, feeding them grandiose promises, fostering a cult of secrecy, and spinning conspiracy-laden tales about saboteurs and shadowy enemies whenever doubts grew too loud. What makes the whole saga even more maddening is that Paprium, for all its chaos, really did deliver on parts of its impossible promise. At least for a tiny handful of people who actually received working copies. When it functions, it's undeniably impressive, with richly detailed pixel art that pushes the Mega Drive far beyond what most believed it could handle. And yet that brilliance only sharpens the tragedy, because here is proof that the ambition hadn't been a lie, that the Mega Drive could still surprise people decades later, and instead of becoming a triumphant swan song, it was buried under years of mismanagement, paranoia, and broken promises. Paprium could have been remembered as a marvel. Instead, it has become a monument to how even genuine technical triumphs can be rendered meaningless when the trust holding everything together has already been burned to the ground. Don't forget, right now you can grab Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge for 53% off, Streets of Rage 4 for 66% off, Double Dragon Gaiden for 83% off, Cowabunga Collection for 78% off, the Capcom Beat 'em Up Bundle for 85% off, plus massive savings on thousands of other games while you're at it. There are thousands of deals to be had, so go on, indulge in your brawler addiction and support this channel at the same time. I'll see you all again next time. Cheerio!